Pokrovsk was supposed to fall to Russia during the summer. Vladimir Putin thought he'd made sure of that when he dedicated 111,000 soldiers to the region. With Pokrovsk under control, the rest of Donetsk would follow, Putin thought. Then, more of Ukraine. Only that's not what happened. Russia's Pokrovsk summer offensive failed as Ukraine developed a brilliant counterattacking strategy to retake more territory than Russia had managed to gain. In the process, Ukraine has turned Pokrovsk into a death trap for Russia, though the fate of the vital city is still uncertain. On September 7th, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, took to Facebook to deliver an interesting statistic about what Russia has achieved, or more accurately, failed to achieve, in Pokrovsk. Despite the sheer volume of troops Russia has dedicated to the region, Ukraine is making the majority of the gains. This is despite Russia launching unprecedented numbers of attacks. The Pokrovsk front remains one of the most challenging. Over the past week, our units have repelled about 350 enemy attacks. This is where Russians concentrate their main efforts and create the largest offensive group trying to breach our defenses, Syrsky reported of the Russian efforts in Pokrovsk over the last few weeks. Many of these enemy attacks are much smaller than those Russia was launching earlier in the war. Back in July, Politico reported that Russia has changed its tactics, where it used to assault Ukrainian defenses with seemingly endless streams of soldiers and mechanized units, creating an exhausting meat grinder designed to wear Ukraine's defenses down. Russia is now using much smaller units. Infiltrators and saboteurs are trying to take territory almost undetected, creating new problems for Ukraine in Pokrovsk. Ukraine responded to these smaller units. It reinvented fortifications around Pokrovsk that were originally built to withstand larger Russian assaults to ensure the smaller units, which were often backed by drones, would be less of a threat. It looks like the new defenses, combined with the Ukrainian strategy that we'll explain later in the video, have worked. But Ukrainian soldiers are bravely maintaining their positions, destroying the enemy personnel and equipment, and conducting effective assault operations. Although having lost 5 square kilometers of the Pokrovsk front in August, the defense forces were able to regain control over 26 square kilometers of Ukrainian land, Syrsky reported on September 7th. What this means is that Putin's grand summer offensive, which was supposed to see Russia finally claim Pokrovsk, hasn't just failed in the sense that Pokrovsk still stands. It's failed to the point where Russia has lost 5 times as much land as it's managed to claim while attempting to take the city. For every Russian gain, there is a Ukrainian counterattack. Territory that Russia believed was safe from Ukraine, even before the summer Pokrovsk offensive, has fallen, meaning Ukraine is making gains at a time when Russia is dedicating more of its soldiers than ever before to the region. This was not supposed to happen, and Ukraine managing to pull off something similar in the region was definitely unexpected. In addition to Pokrovsk, the Kyiv Independent reports that Syrsky says Ukraine has achieved similar levels of gains versus Russia's advances near Dobropillia. We don't have as much information about that region as we do about Pokrovsk. Syrsky didn't provide any specific numbers, instead only stating that Ukraine has more than reversed the gains Russia made in the region. According to the Kyiv Independent, Russia managed to force a dramatic, though ultimately short-lived, advance in Dobropillia back in August, perhaps taking advantage of Ukraine's focus on retaking territory near Pokrovsk. Russia's push involved the use of infiltration tactics, but it has ended, and if Syrsky is accurate, whatever ground Russia gained in Dobropillia during August is back in Ukraine's hands, and then some. It's "and then some" that's the real headline here. For so much of the Ukraine war, the focus has been on Russia slowly grinding away at Ukraine, taking small patches of territory as it did. There were counterattacks before. Ukraine pushed Russia's forces back dramatically during the initial days of Putin's invasion, setting the front line that would become the starting point for the war as we see it today. In 2023, Ukraine also organized a large-scale counteroffensive, though that unfortunately failed to take anywhere near the amount of territory that Ukraine had hoped. But beyond these instances, Ukraine will occasionally retake a settlement, but it's typically Russia that's claiming land. What happened in Pokrovsk, along with Dobropillia, represents a major turnaround. Ukraine has countered Russia's summer offensive rather than merely defending against it, and in doing so, it's turned Pokrovsk and the surrounding regions into a death trap for Russia. In fact, you could say that of Putin's entire summer offensive. In addition to the 111,000 soldiers Russia dedicated to Pokrovsk toward the end of spring, Putin also sent 50,000 troops into Sumy. Putin had plans for both regions. Pokrovsk was supposed to fall. Sumy likely wouldn't, and Putin knew it. However, he believed that his soldiers would be able to take so much territory in that oblast that they could create a buffer zone inside Ukraine. That buffer would prevent Ukraine from launching a renewed counter-invasion of Kursk, protecting the Russian border oblast, as well as Putin's blushes against an invasion of Russia the likes of which we saw in August 2024. Instead, what Russia got was death on a massive scale. UKR Inform reported that the Russian summer offensive had failed to such an extent that it had cost Russia more than 291,000 soldiers. The math doesn't add up here. 110,000 plus 50,000 soldiers equals 170,000, which tells us something important. The soldiers that Putin dedicated to the summer offensive added to those he already had in the Pokrovsk and Sumy regions. Plus, the war is raging elsewhere in Ukraine, meaning Russia is losing soldiers outside of these two key focal points. The information was revealed when the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine took to Facebook to refute claims made by the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov. The Russian chief had tried to claim that Russia's summer offensive was a success because it had managed to create what he called security zones inside Ukraine. That was demonstrably false, Ukraine said. Despite Gerasimov's statements, Russian forces have not gained full control over any major city. Instead, since the beginning of the year, in futile battles in Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions, Russia has lost nearly 210,000 soldiers killed and wounded, along with 2,174 armored fighting vehicles, 1,201 tanks, 7,303 artillery systems, and 157 multiple launch rocket systems destroyed or damaged. It would be an understatement to say that these losses are substantial. They're absolutely massive, and they tell us that Russia has been losing soldiers at an astounding rate during. How many depends on the source. If we take the General Staff's number as given and conservatively say that Russia's summer offensive started at the beginning of March, this amounts to Russia losing 52,000 soldiers per month in its failed attempts to take Pokrovsk and create a buffer in Sumy. Gwara Media, which is an outlet that operates out of Kharkiv, offers some slightly different numbers. It says that The Economist claims that Russia lost 31,000 soldiers in May and June, though these losses were deaths and don't seem to include injuries. The same outlet says that Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reported 28,790 dead or wounded Russian soldiers in August, suggesting that the bulk of Russia's losses came during the 3 months prior. Russia was also losing 124 soldiers to death for every square kilometer it was gaining in August, Gwara Media says. When you combine that information with Syrskyi's revelation that Ukraine has retaken 5 times the amount of territory in Pokrovsk that Russia has captured, those soldiers' deaths can only be considered to be in vain. Russia is struggling to keep its people alive as Putin orders more attacks on Pokrovsk. The entirety of 2025 hasn't been much kinder to Russia, as the General Staff explains in its Facebook post. The figures presented by the occupiers regarding captured territories and settlements are heavily exaggerated, Ukraine's General Staff said. The only 100% verified result achieved by Russia since the beginning of 2025 is its own losses. Over 291,000 soldiers killed and wounded. The mass decoration of 120,000 Russian servicemen only underscores the scale of these losses. The message here is clear. Russia is trying to spin a narrative about the summer offensive that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. That was not how it was supposed to go for Putin. The Atlantic Council sums up Russia's summer failure nicely in a September 2nd article. It points out that Putin's summer offensive wasn't merely about taking territory that would help Russia strategically. The offensive was supposed to send a message to Ukraine and its Western allies. Putin intended to use the taking of Pokrovsk, as well as the creation of a buffer zone in Sumy, to show that a Russian victory is inevitable. Look, Putin will be able to say, I said that Russia would take these regions, and it has. Now you must give Russia what it wants out of a peace settlement, or we will take the rest of Ukraine. Putin has even said something similar in March, the council says, as it quotes him as stating that there are reasons to believe we can finish off Ukraine's military in that month. It's difficult to tell if this was hubris on Putin's part. Russia's leader may have truly believed that his country's victory was inevitable, perhaps due to receiving poor advice from the yes-men in the Kremlin with whom he surrounds himself. Or he may have known his words were nonsense, but he wanted to portray an aura of confidence both domestically and internationally as ceasefire talks started to ramp up. Either way, Putin was mistaken, sorely. The Russian army has been unable to secure any frontline breakthroughs or capture a single major city, with overall Russian advances during the 3 summer months limited to an estimated 0.3% of Ukrainian territory. Crucially, key strategic objectives like Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine remain in Ukrainian hands, the Atlantic Council said in early September. It also highlights the massive price Russia has paid in the blood of its soldiers to make the very modest gains it made during the summer, as yet more proof that Putin's attempts to portray Russia as an inevitable, all-conquering military force are more myth than fact. International perceptions would be changing as a result of Russia's summer failure, the Atlantic Council argues. The West, especially the United States, should ramp up its support because Russia is not inevitable, it's fallible. Ukraine has just proven that by retaking 5 times the amount of territory in Pokrovsk as Russia took in August, all while turning the entire region into a massive death trap for Russia's forces. There's an obvious question we've yet to answer. How did Ukraine transform Russia's summer offensive into such a massive victory for its defenders? We've touched on some of the methods it used already, especially in terms of the rapid transformation of its Pokrovsk fortifications to counterattack Russia's changing tactics when it comes to using smaller units. However, the real turning point came when Ukraine decided that it was no longer going to focus on defense alone. Yes, keeping Pokrovsk safe was and will always be important. However, if Russia wasn't using the same massive mechanized assaults it had in the past, That fact created opportunities for Ukraine. Smaller units are more vulnerable to counterattacks than larger forces, as the former cannot entrench into a piece of territory anywhere near as well as the latter. So Ukraine went on the attack, or more specifically a string of counterattacks. As the Kyiv Independent points out, the news of Ukraine's impressive gains in August reflects an increased frequency of counterattacking operations on the Ukrainian side, which has been in a strategic defensive posture along the front line in eastern Ukraine for almost 2 years. Ukraine's assault forces, which were only officially created on August 18 but were likely operating unofficially for several weeks before, have played a major role in this strategy. The clue is in the name: assault forces. These are units that are going on the attack rather than waiting for Russia to come to them. And we've seen what these assault forces can do several times already since August 18th. On August 20th, Radio Free Europe reported that Ukraine's assault units had managed to cut off an infiltration unit that was on the verge of breaking through the defensive line north of Pokrovsk. That assault unit also offered some much-needed breathing room to the people of Dobropillia, meaning this may have been the territory take-back that Syrskyi mentions in his comments. The Kyiv Post provided more information about this counterattack 6 days later, noting that Ukraine outnumbers the 1,000 to 2,000 soldiers Russia has dedicated to its now broken salient. The troops had also gone on a spree of reclaiming villages Russia had capped, including Mikhailivka, Rakivka, and Volodymyrivka. All three were in Russia's control a week before. Ukraine's counterattacks wrested control back. David Axe provided even more information about Ukraine's counterattacks, noting that many of the forces that now made up Ukraine's new assault units were soldiers who had been involved in the invasion of Kursk. Ukraine had managed to keep between 4 and 5 brigades of these troops, with each brigade being made up of 2,000 soldiers in reserve. When those reserves were unleashed in Pokrovsk, they made a massive difference. Now some of those reserves are finally joining the fight along the last line of trenches and fortified towns 5 or 6 miles outside of Pokrovsk and its vital supply lines, Axe writes. It all adds up to Ukraine forcing Russia into a loss of momentum at a critical juncture. To counterattack the losses Syrskyi discusses, Russia has resorted to some very desperate tactics. On September 5th, the New Voice of Ukraine interviewed a Ukrainian military spokesman named Stanislav Bunyatov. During the course of that interview, the outlet brings up something interesting that Russia has started doing now that it knows that its summer offensive in Pokrovsk has failed. It mentions an instance where Russian soldiers dressed in civilian clothing infiltrated the settlement of Kupiansk for the sole reason of raising a Russian flag, presumably for a photo op. Those soldiers were swiftly killed, but the incident shows us that Putin is happy to lie about the supposed gains Russia is making, rather than accept the truth. Bunyatov explains what Russia is doing. What else do they have left? Bunyatov asks. The so-called spring-summer offensive has already ended, and the Russians failed to achieve a single operational objective, not one. So now, in classic hybrid warfare style, pioneered by General Gerasimov himself, they try to create an illusion of success. Sending men to Kupiansk to raise a flag is about manufacturing a parallel reality. The grand summer offensive in Pokrovsk has been reduced to a propaganda campaign, as Putin tries to hide the fact that Russia failed so badly that it lost more territory than it gained to Ukraine. Flag wavers infiltrating Ukraine's towns and cities exist solely to give the impression that Russia has taken those settlements, when the reality couldn't be more different. So has Russia lost all hope of taking Pokrovsk? It's certainly not taking it as part of Putin's summer offensive, given that summer offensive is now over. However, it would be disingenuous to claim that Russia has given up on Pokrovsk, even though Ukraine has turned it and the surrounding territories into a death trap. That's never stopped Putin before, and it looks like Russia is preparing a renewed offensive designed to help it achieve a breakthrough in the city. That's according to the Ukrainian military itself, per the Kyiv Independent. On September 6th, the outlet reported that Russian troops near Pokrovsk are attempting to secure new positions while expanding the grey zones, which are areas where neither side exercises full control around Pokrovsk. Experienced Russian marine units have been deployed to the region, likely making the small units with which Russia is attacking more dangerous than they were during the summer. Syrskyi has also mentioned the massive volume of assaults Ukraine is dealing with around Pokrovsk, and those don't seem likely to slow down. However, the summer was supposed to be a decisive breakthrough. Don't forget the comments made by Putin that saw Russia's leader act like his enemy was on the ropes and there for the taking. The summer proved that wasn't the case. Though Russia is clearly preparing for something new, Ukraine appears ready to tackle whatever is thrown at it. In the end, Dobropillia may end up deciding the fate of Pokrovsk. That's according to Defense Express CEO Serhiy Zhugrets, who spoke to Espresso TV on September 5th. Russia has recently moved a number of its military units as well, among them 3 or 4 naval infantry brigades and air assault troops, which are being redirected from the eastern flank to hold the eastern sector near Dobropillia, he told the outlet. From the west, our troops are conducting counterattacks, while from the east, the invaders are transferring forces and trying to hold this sector. If Russia can capture Dobropillia, which it seemed closer to doing before Ukraine started launching its counterattacks, that would make Pokrovsk vulnerable to attacks from the north. Russia would also be able to disrupt logistics operations with such an advance, as well as stymie Ukraine as it attempts to push toward Druzhkivka. Russia has more personnel, Zhugrets notes, Ukraine will have to continue its counterattacks while keeping one eye pointed toward the defense of Dobropillia to ensure Russia can't sneak into Pokrovsk by the back door. One thing is for certain, Ukraine will defend Pokrovsk no matter what happens. Ceding it, or any territory, to Russia as part of a peace deal isn't an option, as Zelensky made abundantly clear during a September 3rd interview with the French outlet Le Point. When asked for his response to those who say Ukraine should give Putin what he wants, which includes the Donetsk Oblast, of which Pokrovsk is a part, Zelensky shared a vital message. To those in Europe who reduce the situation to a territorial issue, I say, look at these territories. They are not just land, they are someone's home. They are also the graves of your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. There are also schools and children. This land is mentioned in Ukrainian history books. Films have been shot there. Poems have been written there. The Russians came to try to erase our identity, to rewrite history. We are fighting to preserve our identity. And that's the point. Ukraine is fighting for a sovereignty that Putin wants to steal. Pokrovsk may eventually fall, but if it does, it will be because Russia sacrificed even more tens, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers to take the city. Ukraine will defend to the bitter end to keep Pokrovsk Ukrainian, killing Russians in their thousands. And if it does lose the city, Ukraine will withdraw and fortify elsewhere. That's what has to concern Putin. The summer saw Ukraine turn Pokrovsk into a death trap that destroyed all of Russia's ambitions for the city. What's to say Ukraine won't do the same elsewhere if Russia manages to advance? If Russia does try to advance into and then beyond Pokrovsk, it'll be doing it with fewer tanks than ever before. That's assuming it even has any tanks left for the future. There's a brutal reason why Russia can't use tanks anymore, and it all comes down to a weapon Ukraine has utilized everywhere on the battlefield, including in Pokrovsk. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's and Russia's next moves in the battle for Pokrovsk. And thank you, as always, for watching.